thought, you know what? Maybe I should emotionally destroy myself for somebody who barely notices me. Well, good news, sweetheart. Introducing the Sea Witches Self-Improvement Program. Because apparently being yourself ain't enough anymore. Are you emotionally exhausted? Spiritually confused? Romantically delusional? Or currently sacrificing your mental stability for somebody with the emotional intelligence of driftwood? Then you may qualify for our revolutionary transformation package. Our patented system includes complete voice removal, identity suppression, supernatural body horror, and free emotional devastation with every purchase. That's right. Why communicate your feelings like a healthy person when you could silently suffer while attractive royalty misunderstands you completely? With our tongue extraction technology, you can finally experience emotional repression, Victorian sadness, and catastrophic self-worth issues, all from the comfort of your own ocean floor. But wait, there's more. Our instant leg transformation potion gives you human legs, unbearable agony, constant nerve pain, and the lifelong sensation of walking barefoot through a Home Depot parking lot covered in broken Christmas ornaments. And Buddy the Prince is gonna love watching you dance through the suffering, probably because he has absolutely no clue what's happening emotionally around him at any given moment. But don't worry, every Sea Witch self-improvement package also comes with our emotionally unavailable Prince detector. Features include He Called You Pal, emergency alerts, He Thinks You're Just Shy notifications, and our advanced This Man Has the Awareness of a Microwave Oven tracking system. Still not convinced? Listen to these satisfied customers. Exhausted mermaid. I gave up my voice, my family, my identity, and my nervous system for a prince who married somebody else. Incredible results, Prince. She dances pretty good. Outstanding emotional perception there, Chief. And if you order right now, we'll include 300 years of supernatural community service, TM. Absolutely free. That means invisible ghost labor, emotional purgatory, and existential probation, supervised entirely by random Victorian children. Because nothing says happy ending like external psychological exhaustion. Sea Witches Self-Improvement Program, or TM, not responsible for emotional collapse, identity destruction, sea foam-related incidents, cursed transformations, prince-based disappointment, or discovering your soulmate, has the observational skills of a damp spoon. Do not use Sea Witch Transformation Potion if you value self-respect, enjoy speaking, or possess healthy emotional boundaries. Consult your local underwater nightmare entity before beginning irreversible magical self-destruction. So remember, folks, if somebody only notices you after you destroy yourself trying to make them happy, that ain't love. That's emotional tax fraud. The Sea Witches Self-Improvement Program, turning emotional damage into folklore since 1837. Viewer discretion is advised. This documentary contains historical discussion, folklore analysis, psychological horror, existential dread, maritime death omens, emotional damage, mutilation symbolism, and enough nightmare fuel to make Disney lawyers immediately start sweating through their khakis. Before anybody jumps into the comments section screaming, "You ruined my childhood!" Relax, sweetheart. Nobody's saying Ariel committed tax fraud. Nobody's accusing Sebastian the Crab of racketeering. Nobody's claiming Flounder was moving Colombian blow through the coral reef while King Triton looked the other way. This documentary is intended for commentary, satire, literary analysis, historical discussion, entertainment purposes, and internet anthropology. That means we're examining the original folklore, not the sanitized version where everybody sings reggae music while a seagull with ADHD explains forks. Because apparently every fairy tale in human history started as, here's a horrifying warning about death, mutilation, social control, eternal suffering, and psychological collapse. And then Hollywood looked at it and went, yeah, but what if we added a dancing lobster? Outstanding work, everybody. And for the record, Hans Christian Andersen was not writing a cute little story about following your dreams. The man basically wrote, what if identity destruction became a supernatural body horror nightmare? Then society handed it to children with a smile. Fantastic species we got here. Also, this documentary discusses themes of repression, loneliness, forbidden love, psychological suffering, existential terror, and the emotional consequences of forcing people to become something they are not. Meanwhile, modern society hears all that and says, "Ah, look, singing fish." Tremendous. If you get emotional during this documentary, don't worry, that's normal. If you suddenly realize half the classic fairy tales were psychological warfare disguised as bedtime stories, congratulations, you're finally awake. And if you're one of those people sitting there going, "Bambi, it's just a cartoon, buddy," there's a sea witch harvesting eyeball pearls from drowned brides while cutting tongues out with enchanted knives. This thing stopped being just a cartoon about 17 paragraphs ago. Proceed at your own risk.
Pisa Versa Studios. Palermo Productions. Original documentary. The Little Mermaid, the fairy tale that was really a curse. Written by Bambi Palermo. Narrated by Vincent DiPrio. You think you know The Little Mermaid. A beautiful underwater princess trades her voice for legs, wins the prince's heart, and lives happily ever after. That's the version modern culture sold you. The real story is something else entirely. Hans Christian Andersen's 1837 original tale is not a romance, it's not whimsical, it's not magical. It's a horror story about identity, suffering, self-destruction, and the unbearable agony of trying to belong in a world that demands you mutilate yourself just to be accepted. This isn't a story about true love. It's a story about pain. And once you understand what Andersen was truly writing about, you will never see this fairy tale the same way again. Let's get into it. When mermaids meant death. Long before mermaids became marketable fantasy characters slapped onto lunchboxes, coffee mugs, backpacks, birthday cakes, casino slot machines, and whatever other corporate nightmare humanity could monetize, they were feared across Europe as living omens of catastrophe. Not beauty. Not romance. Not follow your dreams. Death. Pure and simple. To medieval sailors, the ocean itself was already a supernatural graveyard. Most people in the ancient world never traveled farther than a few miles from where they were born. The sea represented chaos, oblivion, and forces humanity could not control. Once you sailed beyond the coastline, you entered a place where the laws of civilization no longer applied. Storms appeared from nowhere. Ships vanished without explanation. Entire crews disappeared into black water and were never found again. And when terrified sailors saw shapes moving beneath the waves, their minds tried to give horror a face. That face became the mermaid. The European ballad The Mermaid, dating back to the 1700s, describes sailors reacting to a mermaid sighting, not with curiosity, but with despair. The crew doesn't prepare weapons, they don't celebrate, they don't try to capture her. They begin praying. Because once a mermaid appeared, the ship was considered doomed already. That's what makes these stories so psychologically disturbing. The mermaid herself often does nothing. She doesn't attack. She doesn't cast lightning. She doesn't drag sailors underwater with giant tentacles like some sea monster from a modern movie. She simply appears. And her appearance alone means death has already made its decision. Imagine the psychological terror of that. Imagine being trapped on a wooden ship in the middle of a violent ocean sometime around 1680. No engines, no radio, no rescue helicopters, no satellite maps, no weather forecasts. Just wood creaking beneath your feet while endless black water stretches in every direction. Then somebody screams from the deck, "There's something in the water!" Everybody rushes over. And there she is. Half woman, half impossible. Watching. Silent. Expressionless. And every man aboard immediately understands what it means. They are already dead. That level of hopelessness is difficult for modern audiences to fully grasp, because we live in a world where almost everything feels controllable. Flat tires, call AAA. Storm warning, check your phone. Lost at sea, GPS. But ancient sailors had none of that security. The ocean was basically a gigantic liquid cemetery that occasionally allowed people to survive. And folklore reflected that fear perfectly. In 1782, a Scottish brig near the Hebrides reportedly recorded one of the most chilling mermaid encounters ever documented. According to the ship's log, a woman's face emerged beside the vessel during heavy fog. Her hair floated unnaturally across the surface of the water like drifting seaweed. The captain described her eyes as neither kind nor cruel, but empty as the void between stars. Buddy, that ain't a mermaid anymore. That's H.P. Lovecraft with waterproof mascara. The crew reportedly panicked so badly some men refused to continue working the sails. Within the week, the ship struck hidden rocks during a sudden squall and sank. Every man aboard drowned. Now, logically, did a magical fish woman cause the storm? Probably not. But psychologically? That story becomes unforgettable. And that's how folklore survives. Not because people literally believe every detail, but because the emotional fear behind it feels real. The Norse told similar stories involving creatures called marmoreal sea beings that appeared before massive storms destroyed fishing fleets. Some described them as human-like. Others described scaled arms, hollow eyes, and rotting skin hanging from skeletal frames. Basically, every ancient culture looked at the ocean and collectively decided, yeah, there's definitely cursed nightmare people living in there. And honestly, fair enough. The stories that created The Little Mermaid. Hans Christian Andersen did not invent The Little Mermaid in a vacuum. That's important. Because when people hear fairy tale, they often imagine a single author creating a whimsical fantasy from imagination. That's not how folklore works. Folklore is generational trauma passed down through metaphor. Every old story is built from older stories. And those stories usually come from centuries of fear, religion, social control, death anxiety, loneliness, war, and emotional suffering. Basically, humanity's entire historical business model. Andersen pulled heavily from two earlier myths, Undine and Melusine. And both are absolutely drenched in horror. Let's start with Undine. Written in 1811 by Friedrich de la Motte Fouquet, Undine tells the story of a water spirit who longs for something humans possess naturally: a soul. Already we're entering psychologically dangerous territory, because the entire premise is built around existential inadequacy. Undine believes she is fundamentally incomplete. Not evil, not monstrous, incomplete. And the only way she can become whole is through the love of a mortal man. Now, pause for a second and look how disturbing that concept actually is. Her entire spiritual existence depends on external validation. That's not romance. That's emotional annihilation waiting to happen. And sure enough, it does. Undine falls in love with a knight named Huldbrand. He marries her. Everything seems beautiful for a while. Then human nature kicks in. The knight becomes interested in another woman. Because folklore men apparently treat loyalty like optional downloadable content. When Huldbrand betrays her, Undine is forced by supernatural law to kill him. Not because she wants revenge, because the universe itself demands it. That's what makes the story tragic. Love itself becomes lethal. She returns to him one final time, appearing beside his bed, dripping with water from the sea. She kisses him, and he suffocates to death. Imagine how horrifying that imagery would feel in the 1800s. The kiss, the ultimate symbol of romance, becomes a murder weapon. Love literally steals breath from the body. That's why modern medicine later borrowed the term Undine's curse for a rare respiratory condition where people stop breathing during sleep. The myth became associated with involuntary suffocation itself. Andersen absolutely absorbed these themes. The longing for a soul, the desire to become human, the agony of loving someone who cannot truly understand your sacrifice. But then comes the second influence, Melusine. And buddy, this one gets real weird. Melusine originates from medieval French folklore and centers around a supernatural woman cursed to transform into a serpent from the waist down every Saturday. Already horrifying. But it gets worse. A nobleman named Raymond falls in love with her and agrees never to spy on her during these transformations. Naturally, he eventually breaks that promise. Because humanity's greatest weakness throughout history has apparently been, hey, maybe don't open that forbidden door. And every human being responds. Counterpoint. I absolutely got to see what's behind that door. So Raymond spies on her. And what he sees destroys everything. Melusine writhes inside a copper bath, half woman, half serpent, scales gleaming in torchlight. Some versions even describe wings erupting from her back. She screams. The windows shatter. She bursts through the castle wall and vanishes forever. But she doesn't truly disappear. She becomes trapped between worlds. Not fully human, not fully monster, not fully alive, not fully dead. Condemned to wander eternally. Sound familiar? That in-between state becomes essential to Andersen's Mermaid. Because the Little Mermaid herself exists in constant limbo. Between sea and land. Between love and rejection. Between body and identity. Between life and oblivion. Andersen takes all these older myths and intensifies them. But here's what makes his version uniquely devastating. The older stories still contain anger. Undine kills the knight. Melusine escapes in fury. Andersen removes that power. His mermaid suffers endlessly and still chooses self-sacrifice. That's what makes the story psychologically brutal. The Little Mermaid isn't allowed rage. She isn't allowed revenge. She internalizes all suffering silently, which reflects exactly what 19th century society expected from people, especially women, outsiders, and anyone forced to suppress their identity for social acceptance. Be beautiful, be obedient, suffer quietly. And if your heart breaks, do it gracefully. That's the real horror underneath Andersen's story. Not sea witches. Not magic. Social expectations so cruel they turn human beings into ghosts long before they die. The sea witch and the true nightmare. This is the point where the story stops feeling like folklore and starts feeling like psychological body horror written by somebody who absolutely needed therapy, but instead got handed a quill and emotional repression. Because Andersen's Sea Witch is not funny, she's not campy, she's not a fabulous purple octopus singing Broadway numbers while body language music plays in the background. Disney gave you a theatrical villain. Andersen gave you an ancient entity living at the bottom of existence itself. And buddy, this lady is horrifying. To reach the Sea Witch, the mermaid must travel beyond the safe parts of the ocean, beyond the coral gardens and glowing palaces of her family, into regions even the sea creatures fear. The water grows darker, colder, dead still. Andersen describes forests of twisted underwater plants that move like skeletal fingers in the current. Sea snakes coil around the branches. Bones litter the seabed, not metaphorical bones, human bones. The remains of people who came seeking impossible bargains, which tells you immediately this witch survives on desperation. That's her ecosystem. Broken people arrive hoping suffering can be traded for transformation. And honestly, that's one of the oldest scams in human history. The path to her home passes through whirlpools and deadly mudflats capable of swallowing entire creatures whole. The witch lives isolated at the bottom of this nightmare realm, surrounded by what essentially amounts to underwater mass graves. And then Andersen introduces one of the most disturbing details in the entire story. The witch cultivates drowned human remains like garden decorations. Skulls line her dwelling, finger bones hang like ornaments. Imagine swimming through pitch-black water and hearing bones clacking together softly in the current like wind chimes made from the dead. No wonder sailors saw mermaids and immediately started praying. Everything down there sounds cursed. And the witch herself? Forget Disney. This creature feels ancient in the worst possible way. Andersen describes her as grotesque, unnaturally aged, physically decayed, yet terrifyingly powerful. Not a sorceress, a force. Something that existed before morality became relevant. Her body is described almost translucently, with dark blood visible beneath her skin. That imagery matters, because throughout the story, Andersen repeatedly blurs the line between beauty and decay. The sea itself is beautiful, but filled with corpses. The mermaid is beautiful, but internally suffering. The potion is beautiful, but made from agony. Everything attractive in this story conceals horror underneath it. And honestly, that's probably the most realistic part of the entire fairy tale. The witch explains the bargain carefully. And this is where the story becomes psychologically devastating. The mermaid wants human legs. The prince's love. And ultimately a soul. But the witch makes one thing clear. Transformation requires destruction, not improvement. Destruction. The mermaid must lose herself completely. And the first thing taken is her voice. Except again, this isn't symbolic surrender. The witch literally cuts out her tongue. Just imagine how horrifying that scene truly is. No music. No dramatic editing. No comic relief fish reacting in the background like some underwater Disney intern collecting a paycheck. Just silence. A blade. Blood clouding through seawater. And a terrified young girl allowing herself to be mutilated because she believes love will finally make her worthy of existence. That's the actual story. And buddy, that is dark. Then comes the potion. This scene reads less like a fairy tale and more like something written during a fever dream after eating expired shellfish in a haunted monastery at 3 in the morning. The witch brews the potion using serpent venom blood from her own body, scales ripped from the mermaid's tail, enchanted ingredients associated with death and drowning. The cauldron itself is described almost like a living thing. Anderson says the potion screams while boiling. Not bubbles, screams. The suffering of everyone who sacrificed themselves for love becomes physically embedded into the liquid itself. Think about how insane that imagery actually is. Love isn't portrayed as healing. It's portrayed as generational suffering recycled endlessly across time. Every broken heart becomes fuel for the next victim. That's practically Gothic psychological philosophy disguised as folklore. And then comes the transformation itself. Modern audiences usually imagine magical sparkles, a pretty glow, a quick change, maybe some whimsical orchestra music swelling dramatically while Sebastian the Crab sings about property damage. No, absolutely not. Anderson describes the process like surgical torture without anesthesia. When the mermaid drinks the potion, her body convulses violently. She collapses. She feels as though a sword tears through her entire body. Her tail splits apart. Bones crack and reshape. Her organs reorganize themselves. Imagine every joint in your body dislocating simultaneously while your lungs suddenly begin functioning differently for the first time. That's what Anderson is describing. This isn't becoming human. This is evolutionary violence. And what makes it even worse psychologically is that the transformation never truly ends. The pain becomes permanent. Every step afterward feels like walking on knives. Not figuratively, literally. Anderson repeatedly emphasizes blood flowing from her feet whenever she walks or dances. Now pause for a second and think about how disturbing the prince's role becomes here. Obedient. Suffering quietly. And that social commentary is absolutely vicious. Anderson understood something terrifying about society. People often reward you most when you erase yourself for their comfort. That's the nightmare hidden inside this fairy tale. Not magic. Not monsters. The horrifying realization that the world sometimes applauds your destruction as long as you remain pleasant while it happens. And, buddy, that's a hell of a thing to hide inside a children's story about a fish girl. Because he loves watching her dance. He praises her elegance. Her grace. Meanwhile, every movement feels like mutilation. She suffers constantly just to maintain the illusion of beauty. And she cannot explain any of it. Because she no longer has a voice. That's what makes this story emotionally horrifying. The mermaid becomes trapped performing happiness while enduring unbearable pain internally. And honestly, That's probably why the story still resonates with people nearly 200 years later. Because underneath the fantasy lies a brutally human truth. A lot of people spend their entire lives doing exactly that. Smiling externally, bleeding internally. Trying desperately to become lovable enough for a world that keeps demanding more pieces of them. And Anderson pushes this horror even further through symbolism. In ancient folklore, a mermaid's voice was not ordinary. It was supernatural power. Their songs could lure sailors, calm storms, enchant minds, command emotional reactions. Their voices represented identity itself. Agency, presence, influence. The witch doesn't merely silence the mermaid. She removes everything that makes her powerful. Everything dangerous, everything authentic, everything real. Now suddenly the mermaid becomes the ideal 19th century woman. Beautiful, graceful, silent. Walking on knives. The transformation is the point where the Little Mermaid stops being fantasy altogether and becomes something painfully human. Because Anderson understood something most fairy tales avoid saying out loud. Changing yourself to gain acceptance doesn't feel magical. It feels violent. And the mermaid's suffering does not end once she gets her legs. That's when the real horror begins. Modern adaptations usually portray transformation as liberation. A glow, a makeover, a triumphant musical number, maybe some inspirational orchestral swelling while everybody learns the power of believing in themselves. Meanwhile, Anderson looked at that concept and basically said, "What if becoming accepted destroyed you physically and emotionally forever?" The mermaid awakens on the shore, naked, voiceless, and in agony. Not delicate discomfort. Agony. Anderson describes her sensation as though sharp knives pierce her feet every time she moves. Blood flows with every step. Every movement becomes suffering. And what makes the imagery even darker is that nobody around her fully understands what she sacrificed to stand there. The prince sees beauty, grace, mystery. He has absolutely no idea she mutilated herself for him, and she cannot explain it. That silence matters. Because the mermaid's suffering becomes invisible labor. She performs elegance while concealing unbearable pain. That's one of the most psychologically devastating elements in the story. Especially when you remember Anderson himself spent his entire life hiding emotional suffering beneath public performance. The mermaid constantly suppresses her true condition because society rewards appearances, not honesty. And buddy, that concept aged a little too well. Think about how many people today walk around doing exactly that. Smiling while miserable, performing confidence while collapsing internally, destroying themselves quietly to remain socially acceptable. Anderson somehow predicted modern emotional burnout in 1837, while everybody else was still riding around in horse carriages eating boiled cabbage. That's impressive. The prince grows fascinated with the mermaid because she seems strange and ethereal. She dances beautifully. But Anderson makes the horror explicit. Every movement tears through her body like blades. Imagine dancing ballet barefoot across shattered glass while pretending everything is perfectly fine because the audience applauds your suffering as beauty. That's essentially what the mermaid experiences daily. And she endures all of it because she believes eventually the prince will love her enough to save her soul. That's the tragedy. The pain itself becomes normalized. The more she suffers, the more valuable she believes the goal must be. Which again, is disturbingly human. People convince themselves, if I sacrifice enough, if I hurt enough, if I erase enough of myself, eventually somebody will love me. And sometimes that moment never comes. That's Andersen's nightmare. The mermaid cannot return to the ocean. Her old life is gone permanently. Even touching seawater causes pain now. The transformation alienates her from both worlds. She no longer belongs beneath the sea. But she never fully belongs on land either. And psychologically, that's devastating. Because the mermaid exists in permanent displacement. Too changed to go home, too different to fit in. There's a reason marginalized audiences throughout history connected deeply with this story, long before modern literary scholars began analyzing Andersen's personal life. The metaphor is painfully clear. The mermaid changes herself to survive socially, but survival itself becomes isolation. She gains access to the human world only by abandoning everything that originally defined her: her voice, her family, her identity, her physical nature, her culture, her power. And even after sacrificing all of it, she's still treated like an outsider. The prince cares for her, but not fully. Not completely. Not in the way she desperately needs. He calls her affectionate names, keeps her near him constantly, treats her almost like a beloved pet or child. But never as an equal. Never as someone whose inner suffering he truly understands. And that detail makes the relationship tragic rather than romantic. Because the prince loves the version of the mermaid he sees, not the reality of who she is. He loves the performance, the mystery, the beauty, not the pain underneath it. And honestly, that's one of the cruelest truths in the entire story. Sometimes people love the version of you that required your own destruction to create, and they never even realize it. Meanwhile, the mermaid watches the prince move freely through the world she sacrificed everything to join. He laughs effortlessly, speaks effortlessly, exists effortlessly. Things she now struggles to do every second. Andersen repeatedly emphasizes how unnatural human movement feels to her. She has no instinct for walking, no bodily memory of legs. Every gesture requires conscious effort. Think about how horrifying that actually is. Imagine waking up trapped inside a body that fundamentally feels wrong to you. Every movement awkward, every sensation unfamiliar, every action exhausting. The body itself becomes alien territory. That's body horror on an existential level. Andersen may not have possessed modern psychological terminology, but emotionally he understood alienation perfectly. The mermaid's transformation creates permanent disconnection between body and identity. She exists in constant self-awareness, constant discomfort, constant performance. And because she cannot speak, nobody truly knows what she feels. That silence becomes unbearable, especially in scenes where the prince talks openly to her about the woman he actually loves. The princess from the neighboring kingdom. The woman he mistakenly believes rescued him. Meanwhile, the real savior stands beside him, silently bleeding through every step. unable to tell the truth. That emotional cruelty is brutal. Andersen creates scene after scene where the mermaid witnesses her own invisibility. The prince confides in her, trusts her, feels emotionally close to her, but never sees her completely, never understands her sacrifice, never realizes the agony standing directly beside him. And that dynamic reflects Andersen's personal life almost perfectly. He loved people who could never fully understand him, could never publicly acknowledge him, could never return his feelings in the way he longed for. The mermaid's silence mirrors emotional repression itself. And the longer the story continues, the more obvious it becomes that the transformation was never meant to save her. It was meant to erase her. That's the real horror underneath the fairy tale. The witch doesn't simply give the mermaid legs. She creates a version of the mermaid acceptable to human society. A quieter version, a weaker version, a suffering version. And society rewards that destruction immediately. People admire her beauty, praise her grace, celebrate her silence. Meanwhile, internally, she is deteriorating. And guys, that's not fantasy anymore. That's social commentary sharp enough to cut bone. The real secret of the story. This is the chapter where The Little Mermaid stops being a fairy tale entirely. Because once you understand Hans Christian Andersen's real life, the entire story mutates into something emotionally devastating. Suddenly, the sea witch isn't just a monster. The transformation isn't just magic. The pain isn't symbolic fantasy anymore. It becomes autobiography. And yeah, once you see it, you can't unsee it. Hans Christian Andersen began writing The Little Mermaid in 1836, during one of the most emotionally painful periods of his life. He was deeply in love with a man named Edvard Collin. Not casually infatuated. Not maybe there was something there. Deeply, painfully, hopelessly in love. Collin was the son of Andersen's patron and close friend throughout adulthood. Andersen wrote him letters overflowing with emotional intensity. In one letter, he confessed, "My sentiments for you are those of a woman." Think about how dangerous that sentence was in 1830s Denmark. This wasn't modern society. There were no public discussions about sexuality, no protection, no safe social acceptance. Homosexuality wasn't merely frowned upon. It could destroy your life completely. Public humiliation, isolation, social exile, potential criminal punishment. Andersen lived in a world where loving the wrong person meant you learned to survive through concealment. Which suddenly makes the mermaid's silence horrifyingly personal. Imagine Copenhagen in the 1830s. Cold harbor winds. Gas lamps flickering across wet cobblestone streets. Church bells echoing through narrow alleyways. Society obsessed with morality, religious obedience, and public appearance. Every conversation monitored through invisible social rules. Every emotional impulse carefully controlled. Men were expected to marry. Women were expected to obey. Everyone was expected to perform normalcy. And beneath all of it sat unbearable silence. Andersen wandered through that world carrying emotions he could never fully express publicly. That's what the mermaid becomes. Not just a magical creature. A person forced to mutilate their authentic self in order to survive socially. Suddenly, the transformation takes on a terrifying new meaning. The mermaid abandons her voice because Andersen himself could never safely use his own. She walks on knives because every social interaction became emotionally dangerous terrain. She falls in love with someone who can never fully love her back in the way she needs. That's not fantasy anymore. That's emotional autobiography disguised as folklore. And the parallels become overwhelming once you start noticing them. The mermaid desperately wants entry into another world. A world she idealizes. A world she believes contains acceptance, love, meaning, and ultimately, salvation. But access to that world requires destroying herself first. That mirrors Andersen's entire social existence. He spent his life trying to enter elite society, literary circles, aristocratic spaces, intellectual communities, but he always remained slightly outside them. Too strange, too emotional, too awkward, too different. Even when successful, Andersen reportedly felt socially alienated constantly, which again mirrors the mermaid perfectly. She enters the human world, but never fully belongs there. And then comes the most heartbreaking parallel of all. Edvard Collin eventually married a woman, just like the prince marries another princess. Imagine what Andersen must have felt attending social events, knowing the man he loved would build a life with someone else while he stood nearby pretending happiness. That emotional torture appears directly inside the story. The prince trusts the mermaid deeply, feels comforted by her, keeps her close constantly, but never recognizes her as the person who truly saved him. That's psychologically brutal because it reflects emotional invisibility. The worst pain isn't hatred. It's being unseen. The mermaid stands beside the prince every day, silently carrying overwhelming love, while knowing he fundamentally misunderstands her identity. Andersen understood that feeling intimately. There's a reason the story obsesses over silence. Silence becomes survival. The mermaid literally loses her tongue. Andersen metaphorically lost his own. He could not publicly articulate the truth of his emotional life without risking destruction. So instead, he encoded it into fairy tales. That's what makes old folklore fascinating. Sometimes stories become emotional smuggling operations. Authors hide unbearable truths inside fantasy because fantasy is safer than honesty. A fish girl longing for another world sounds harmless enough for polite society. A deeply closeted man confessing emotional agony openly? That was dangerous. So Andersen disguised himself. He became the mermaid. And the more you examine the story through that lens, the darker everything becomes. The transformation stops feeling empowering. It becomes self-erasure. The prince stops feeling romantic. He becomes symbolic of unattainable acceptance. And the sea witch becomes terrifying because she offers exactly what society demanded from people like Andersen. Destroy your authentic self, and maybe then you'll be allowed near happiness. That's the bargain. Not just in the story. In society itself. And honestly, that's what makes The Little Mermaid feel weirdly modern despite being written almost 200 years ago. Because people still do this constantly. Maybe not through literal sea witch contracts, although honestly, social media feels spiritually close at this point, but people absolutely reshape themselves hoping acceptance will finally arrive. They silence themselves, change themselves, perform versions of themselves, hide pieces of themselves. all hoping eventually somebody says, "Now you're worthy of love." And Anderson understood the horrifying truth underneath that pursuit. Sometimes the transformation succeeds externally and still leaves you emotionally destroyed internally. That's the mermaid's tragedy. She achieves the impossible. She becomes human. But the closer she gets to acceptance, the farther she drifts from herself. And guys, that's one of the saddest things ever hidden inside a so-called children's story. Because underneath all the ocean imagery and folklore symbolism lies a brutally human fear. What if becoming lovable requires becoming someone else entirely? And worse, what if even after all that sacrifice, it still isn't enough? The prince never really saw her. This is where Anderson twists the knife. Because the true horror of the Little Mermaid is not the sea witch. It's not the transformation. It's not even the physical suffering. The real horror is emotional invisibility. The prince never truly sees her. And crew that hurts worse than any monster in the story. Modern adaptations frame the prince as the reward. The goal, the happy ending, the true love waiting at the finish line. But Anderson's prince is something much more unsettling. He is kind, gentle, affectionate, and completely incapable of understanding the devastation standing right beside him. That's what makes this tragedy so psychologically brutal. If the prince were cruel, the story would be easier. If he mocked her, abused her, rejected her maliciously, then the mermaid's suffering would at least make emotional sense. But he doesn't. He genuinely likes her. He cares for her deeply. He keeps her close constantly. And somehow that makes everything worse. Because the mermaid receives just enough affection to keep hoping. That's the torture. The prince calls her his little foundling. He treats her almost like a beloved companion animal or younger sister. He praises her beauty, admires her dancing, enjoys her company. But he never understands the truth. Never asks the right questions. Never looks beyond the surface of what she performs for him. Anderson repeatedly emphasizes how much the prince enjoys her dancing. Think about how horrifying that detail becomes once you understand what the dancing actually costs her. Every spin tears through her feet like knives. Every graceful movement causes agony. She performs suffering as entertainment. And the prince applauds it. Not maliciously. Ignorantly. That distinction matters. Because the story becomes a devastating metaphor for relationships built on unseen sacrifice. The mermaid destroys herself quietly while the prince enjoys the results of that destruction without realizing it. And honestly, a lot of people relate to that dynamic. People constantly overextend emotionally, silence their pain, reshape themselves for relationships, sacrifice personal identity, hide suffering to appear lovable, while the other person never fully understands the cost. That's Anderson's real nightmare. Love becoming a performance so consuming that your authentic self disappears underneath it. And the prince unknowingly reinforces this constantly. He tells the mermaid about the woman he truly loves, the princess he believes rescued him. Meanwhile, the actual person who saved his life stands beside him silently. Imagine that emotional torture. You save somebody, destroy yourself for them, bleed for them, abandon your entire identity for them. And then they confide in you about loving somebody else. That's devastating. But Anderson makes it even crueler because the mermaid cannot defend herself. She has no voice. She literally cannot tell the truth. The person most desperate to be understood becomes physically incapable of self-expression. That's not subtle symbolism. That's emotional warfare disguised as folklore. Anderson understood deeply what it felt like to carry overwhelming feelings that could not safely be spoken aloud. That silence saturates every page of the story. The mermaid listens constantly. She watches, observes, endures, but she cannot reveal herself honestly. Which means the prince falls in love with an illusion. Not because he's evil, because he lacks understanding. And that's one of the most painful truths in human relationships. Sometimes people fail you simply because they cannot see beyond the version of you they're comfortable with. The prince loves the mermaid's beauty, her gentleness, her mystery, her silence. But the silence itself is part of the tragedy. He loves the version of her created through suffering. That's horrifying. Anderson essentially asks a devastating question. If someone only loves the version of you built through self-erasure, do they actually love you at all? That question sits underneath the entire story like a buried knife. And it gets darker once the neighboring princess enters the narrative. The prince becomes convinced she was the one who rescued him from the shipwreck. He idealizes her instantly, builds fantasies around her, projects meaning onto her. Meanwhile, the mermaid stands there watching herself become emotionally replaced by a misunderstanding. And the truly brutal part? She doesn't even blame him. That's what destroys you emotionally reading Anderson's version. The mermaid never becomes bitter, never hateful, never vindictive. She internalizes the pain completely, and that reflects the emotional conditioning of Anderson's society perfectly. Suffer quietly, love quietly, lose quietly. Remain graceful while your heart collapses internally. The prince announces his marriage happily. He shares his joy openly with the mermaid because he trusts her completely. Imagine how psychologically horrifying that scene is from her perspective. Every word feels like another knife. And yet she smiles, nods, stays beside him, because she loves him more than she values herself. That's the real tragedy. Not unrequited love. Self-destruction disguised as devotion. And kids. That hits hard. Especially because Anderson refuses to give the audience emotional release. There's no confrontation scene, no dramatic reveal, no moment where the prince suddenly understands everything and falls to his knees apologizing. Real life often doesn't work that way. People frequently never understand the damage they caused. Not because they're monsters, because they never saw the full truth to begin with. Anderson understood that kind of loneliness intimately. The loneliness of being emotionally present while fundamentally unseen. The mermaid becomes almost ghost-like throughout these chapters. Always nearby, always watching, always suffering invisibly. Which foreshadows what she literally becomes later, a spirit drifting unseen through the world. And psychologically, that transformation already began long before she died. Because once she surrendered her voice, once she abandoned herself entirely for acceptance, part of her was already disappearing. That's the hidden cruelty of the story. The prince never kills the mermaid. Society does, through expectations, through silence, through conditional acceptance, through rewarding self-destruction as beauty. And the prince simply becomes the final mirror, reflecting what she most fears. That no matter how much she sacrifices, she may still never truly be loved for who she really is. The dagger and the choice to disappear. This is the moment where the story reaches full tragedy. No more hope, no more illusions, no more fantasy that sacrifice will somehow lead to salvation. Everything collapses here. The prince marries another woman. The wedding ship glows with celebration while the mermaid quietly approaches the end of her existence. And Anderson paints this entire sequence like a funeral disguised as a royal ceremony. Music echoes across the sea. Lanterns flicker against the dark water. Guests celebrate love and destiny while standing directly beside somebody being psychologically annihilated in silence. And Buddy. That image alone is devastating. The mermaid watches the prince smile at another woman with the same face she once dreamed would save her. Think about the emotional horror underneath that. Every sacrifice she made now becomes meaningless. The pain, the mutilation, the silence, the blood, the isolation, the destruction of her identity. None of it mattered. Anderson understood something brutally human here. Sometimes suffering does not lead to reward. Sometimes pain changes nothing. That's one of the hardest truths people ever learn in life. The universe does not automatically compensate you for what you endured. And fairy tales usually avoid that reality. Traditional stories promise, if you suffer nobly enough, eventually happiness arrives. Anderson says, no, sometimes your suffering simply destroys you. That's why this story feels emotionally different from almost every sanitized adaptation that followed. It refuses comfort. Then comes one of the darkest scenes in the entire tale. The mermaid's sisters rise from the sea, but they are changed. Their beautiful hair is gone, shorn completely away. And in mermaid folklore, hair represented beauty, power, identity, and connection to the sea itself. Meaning they sacrificed pieces of themselves too. The destruction spreads through the family like emotional contagion. Pain reproduces pain. That's another recurring theme in Anderson's work, love creating cycles of suffering rather than healing them. The sisters traded their hair to the sea witch for a weapon. A dagger. And not just any dagger. The blade is enchanted, forged specifically to undo the transformation. The rules are simple. Kill the prince before sunrise. Let his blood touch your feet. And the mermaid becomes a mermaid again. She survives. That's the choice. And Anderson constructs this scene almost like psychological torture. Because for the first time in the story, the mermaid finally has power. Real power. Until now, she's been passive, suffering, enduring, sacrificing, obeying. But now fate places another person's life directly into her hands. And the imagery becomes terrifying. The prince sleeps peacefully beside his bride. Moonlight spills across the cabin. Outside, the ocean moves softly against the ship. Everything feels calm, still, fragile. Meanwhile, the mermaid stands over him, holding a blade sharp enough to restore her entire existence. Imagine the emotional storm inside her at that moment. One movement and the pain ends. Her tail returns. Her family comes back. Her old life is restored. She survives. And honestly, a lot of people reading this scene secretly expect revenge. Because revenge feels emotionally logical. The prince unknowingly destroyed her life. Why shouldn't she save herself? But Anderson refuses to give the audience catharsis. That's important. The mermaid looks at the prince sleeping. And she still loves him. Even now. Even after everything. That's what makes this scene unbearable emotionally. Her love survives her destruction. The knife trembles in her hand. Anderson describes her staring at the prince's face one final time. The same face she crossed worlds for, destroyed herself for, suffered endlessly for. And she cannot do it. Not because she fears punishment. Not because she lacks opportunity. Because despite everything, she refuses to become monstrous to survive. That distinction matters. The sea witch's bargain always demanded destruction. But now the mermaid rejects that logic entirely. She would rather die than save herself through violence. And sweetheart, that's where the story becomes almost spiritually tragic. Because Anderson frames this as the final act of pure love. Not romantic love, selfless love. The kind that asks for nothing in return. The mermaid throws the dagger into the sea. And then comes one of the most haunting images in the story. The water turns red where the blade disappears. As if the ocean itself begins bleeding. That symbolism is incredible. The sea becomes wounded alongside her. The entire world reflects the violence of what's happening emotionally. Then she throws herself overboard, and here Anderson delivers one of the bleakest moments in fairy tale history. The mermaid fully expects annihilation, not heaven, not peace, oblivion. Remember, mermaids do not possess souls in Anderson's mythology. When they die, they dissolve into sea foam. That's it. No afterlife, no reunion, no continuation. Complete erasure. Imagine how terrifying that belief system truly is psychologically. Most religions offer some version of continuation after death. Even suffering eventually ends, but Anderson's mermaids face something worse than death, non-existence. The complete extinction of consciousness itself, and the mermaid chooses that fate willingly. That's how unbearable her situation became. She would rather disappear from reality entirely than kill the person she loves. And that sacrifice transforms the story from tragic romance into existential horror. Because ultimately the mermaid receives nothing. No prince, no soul, no home, no voice, no body restored. Only the choice between becoming violent or ceasing to exist. And she chooses disappearance. That's devastating. Especially because Anderson clearly understood this emotionally himself. People forced to suppress identity often internalize the belief that their existence itself becomes burdensome to others. The mermaid reaches a point where annihilation feels morally preferable to asserting her own survival. That's not fantasy anymore. That's depression. That's emotional self-erasure. That's the horrifying psychological cost of believing your needs matter less than everyone else's happiness. And the truly heartbreaking part? The prince never even realizes what almost happened. He sleeps peacefully through the entire scene, completely unaware that someone loved him enough to die quietly beside him rather than cause him pain. And that's one of the saddest things Andersen ever wrote. The 300-year sentence. And this is where Andersen completely abandons the idea of a traditional fairy tale ending. Because after everything the mermaid endured, mutilation, silence, rejection, emotional destruction, physical agony, the loss of her identity, the surrender of her entire existence, you would think death would at least bring peace. Nope. Hans Christian Andersen looked at emotional devastation and said, "You know what this story needs? Supernatural prole." Instead of dissolving into sea foam forever, the mermaid awakens transformed into something called a daughter of the air. Not human, not mermaid, not spirit exactly, something in between. Again, that pattern matters. The mermaid never fully belongs anywhere, not beneath the sea, not among humans, not even in death. She exists permanently trapped between states of being. Andersen describes the daughters of the air as translucent beings drifting invisibly through the world. They move through forests, deserts, frozen oceans, and cities performing good deeds for humanity. Cooling the foreheads of the sick, bringing gentle breezes to suffering people, helping children quietly from the shadows. And on paper, that almost sounds comforting. Until Andersen reveals the actual rules. The mermaid is sentenced to 300 years of servitude before she can finally gain a soul. 300 years. And most people can't survive a 3-minute customer service phone call without emotionally collapsing. Imagine serving faithfully for 290 years. Then somewhere, a Victorian child steals a cookie, and suddenly, congratulations, 20 more years. And it gets worse, much worse. Because the sentence isn't fixed. Every good child she encounters shortens her punishment. Every bad child extends it. Meaning her salvation depends entirely on the random behavior of strangers she cannot control. That's not redemption, that's cosmic psychological torture. Imagine serving faithfully for 290 years, then somewhere a Victorian child steals a cookie, and suddenly, congratulations, 20 more years. That is insane. Andersen basically invented a supernatural customer satisfaction survey from hell. But underneath the fantasy lies something much darker. This entire ending is a direct reflection of 19th century moral anxiety. In Andersen's Denmark, children were expected to embody absolute obedience and purity. Parents obsessed over appearances, religious perfection, social respectability. Children were judged constantly. A polite child reflected moral success. A disobedient child reflected family failure, which meant childhood itself became performance. Sound familiar? The mermaid already spent the entire story performing acceptability through suffering. Now even her afterlife depends on other people successfully performing morality too. Andersen creates a universe where peace is permanently conditional. That's the real horror. The mermaid can never relax. Never arrive, never rest. Even after sacrificing everything, acceptance remains temporary and uncertain. That reflects Andersen's emotional worldview perfectly. Because closeted people in heavily repressive societies often experience life exactly that way. Acceptance feels conditional. Safety feels temporary. Belonging feels fragile. Identity feels negotiable. One mistake, one revelation, one social failure, and everything collapses. The mermaid's sentence becomes a metaphor for endless emotional probation. And psychologically, that's exhausting. Anderson understood deeply what it meant to feel perpetually evaluated by society. He spent his entire life navigating social circles where respect depended heavily on performance, manners, presentation, and emotional restraint. The Daughters of the Air reflect that anxiety beautifully and horrifyingly. They become invisible emotional laborers, doing good constantly, seeking approval constantly, trying to earn worthiness constantly. And guys, a lot of people still live like that today. Trying endlessly to deserve love, deserve acceptance, deserve existence itself. As if being human requires passing some invisible moral exam every single day. And the truly devastating part? The mermaid still remains voiceless. Even now. She drifts through the world silently observing human life without fully participating in it. Watching families laugh together, watching lovers embrace, watching children grow. Always nearby. Never included. That imagery feels ghostly because emotionally it is ghostly. The mermaid essentially becomes a metaphor for alienation itself. Present but unseen. Existing but disconnected. Close enough to witness happiness, never close enough to truly touch it. Anderson even describes the Daughters of the Air weeping invisibly. Their tears become morning dew. Think about how heartbreakingly poetic that is. Human beings wake up seeing dew on flowers and grass, completely unaware it symbolizes centuries of hidden sorrow from invisible souls drifting above them. That's one of the saddest concepts in literary history. Pain becoming so normalized it transforms into part of the environment itself. And unlike modern fairy tales, Anderson offers no guarantee the mermaid will succeed. That's critical. The story does not end with, and then she earned her soul happily ever after. No. Her redemption remains uncertain. Open-ended. Fragile. Potentially endless. And that ambiguity makes the ending terrifying. Because the mermaid's suffering no longer feels temporary. It feels eternal. The story becomes less about romance and more about impossible longing itself. Longing for acceptance, identity, peace, love, belonging, spiritual certainty. Things the mermaid spends the entire story chasing but never fully reaching. And honestly, that's probably why this fairy tale still unsettles people centuries later. Because beneath the fantasy lies a deeply human fear. What if no amount of sacrifice is ever enough? What if acceptance always stays one step out of reach? What if the world keeps demanding pieces of you forever while promising salvation eventually? That's Anderson's real ending. Not happiness. Endless striving. The mermaid doesn't get rescued. She becomes another invisible soul wandering through existence, hoping goodness might finally earn what should never have required earning in the first place. And yeah, that's not a children's fairy tale anymore. That's existential horror wearing seashell jewelry. The monster was never the mermaid. By the end of The Little Mermaid, something strange happens. You realize the sea witch was never the true villain. Neither was the prince. Not really. Even the ocean itself, terrifying as it is, simply behaves according to its nature. The real monster in Andersen's story is something far more disturbing. A society that convinces people they must destroy themselves to deserve love. That's the horror. And once you realize that, the entire fairy tale transforms. Because the mermaid never actually wanted power. She never wanted conquest, revenge, violence. She wanted belonging. That's all. Andersen understood that longing intimately because he lived inside it. Throughout his life, he existed as an outsider. Socially awkward. Emotionally intense. Physically insecure. Desperately seeking acceptance from elite society. He spent years trying to reinvent himself through culture, education, status, and artistic success. And despite becoming world famous, he reportedly remained deeply lonely. That emotional loneliness saturates The Little Mermaid from beginning to end. The mermaid constantly believes, if I can just change enough, suffer enough, become enough, then maybe I'll finally deserve love. And sweetheart. That mindset destroys people. Because it creates a world where identity itself becomes negotiable. Where self-worth depends entirely on external approval. The sea witch understands this immediately. That's why she barely needs to manipulate the mermaid. The mermaid arrives already believing she is incomplete. That's the key. The most dangerous systems in society are the ones where people willingly participate in their own destruction because they've been taught suffering will eventually earn acceptance. Andersen saw that everywhere in 19th century Europe. Rigid gender expectations. Religious moralism. Class hierarchy. Social conformity. Emotional repression. Everybody performing acceptable versions of themselves to survive socially. The mermaid simply becomes the purest expression of that suffering. She literally reshapes her body for acceptance. Silences herself for acceptance. Bleeds for acceptance. Abandons her family, her identity, and her natural existence for acceptance. And what does society give her in return? Conditional affection. Temporary proximity. Invisible suffering. That's brutal. Especially because the prince genuinely believes he's kind to her. And in many ways, he is. That's what makes the story emotionally realistic. People don't always hurt others intentionally. Sometimes they simply benefit from sacrifices they never notice. The prince enjoys the mermaid's beauty and devotion without understanding what those things cost her. That dynamic exists everywhere in human relationships. Parents, friends, partners, societies. People often celebrate the polished version of somebody while remaining completely unaware of the emotional damage required to create it. Andersen's mermaid becomes trapped inside that performance permanently. Which is why the story resonates so strongly with people throughout different generations and identities. Because almost everybody knows what it feels like to hide parts of themselves for survival. Maybe not literally trading your tail to an underwater demon. Although honestly, corporate job interviews get spiritually close. But people absolutely learn what emotions are acceptable, what identities are safe, what behaviors earn approval, what truths must stay hidden. And the longer somebody performs that survival role, the more disconnected they become from themselves. That's the mermaid's tragedy. She loses herself gradually while believing she's moving closer to happiness. And Anderson understood something terrifying. The world often rewards self-erasure. Look at how everybody responds to the mermaid after her transformation. Humans admire her more once she becomes quieter, weaker, dependent, silent, physically suffering. That's not accidental symbolism. That's social criticism sharp enough to draw blood. Anderson was exposing how society romanticizes suffering when it appears graceful, especially feminine suffering. The mermaid becomes more desirable the less space she takes up emotionally. That idea remains horrifyingly relevant today. People still praise others for staying quiet, being easy, never complaining, sacrificing endlessly, smiling through pain. Meanwhile, internally, those people may be collapsing completely. And the story asks a devastating question. If love requires destroying yourself, is it really love? That question haunts every chapter, because the mermaid never receives unconditional acceptance. Only conditions. Only bargains. Only expectations. The witch gives conditional transformation. The prince gives conditional affection. The daughters of the air offer conditional salvation. Every relationship in the story requires the mermaid to earn worthiness through suffering. That's why the ending feels so emotionally exhausting. There is never a moment where someone simply says, "You are enough exactly as you are." Never. And that absence hurts more than the knives. That's the true nightmare hidden underneath the fairy tale. Not sea monsters. Not curses. The belief that love must be purchased through pain. And once people internalize that idea, they begin volunteering pieces of themselves to the world, hoping eventually somebody will let them stay. That's the real horror Anderson understood. Not all prisons have walls. Some are built from expectations. Some are built from shame. Some are built from the terrifying fear that if people ever saw the real you, they might stop loving you entirely. The mermaid becomes trapped inside exactly that fear. And in the end, she never truly escapes it. She simply becomes invisible. A spirit wandering endlessly through the world, helping others while remaining emotionally untouchable herself. Which honestly might be the saddest ending Anderson could possibly have written. Because the final tragedy of The Little Mermaid is not that the mermaid dies, it's that she spends the entire story believing she was the thing that needed fixing in the first place. The fairy tale they sanitized. By the time most people encounter The Little Mermaid, the original story is already gone. Buried. Softened. Sanitized into something safe enough to sell to children and profitable enough to turn into a global franchise worth billions. And honestly, that transformation alone perfectly proves Anderson's point. Because modern culture does to fairy tales exactly what the mermaid does to herself. It cuts away the uncomfortable parts until something prettier remains. Disney's 1989 adaptation fundamentally rewrote the emotional DNA of the story. The existential horror vanished. The religious anxiety vanished. The psychological suffering vanished. The body horror vanished. The social commentary vanished. The closeted loneliness vanished. And in its place came musical numbers, comic relief, marketable side characters, romance, optimism, and a triumphant happy ending. Now, to be fair, the Disney version works beautifully as entertainment. The animation is gorgeous. The music is iconic. And somewhere right now, Sebastian is still screaming about crustacean jazz while traumatized millennials sing along in traffic. But emotionally, it's a completely different story. Disney transformed a tragedy about self-erasure into a fantasy about self-fulfillment. That's a massive shift. In Anderson's version, the mermaid changes herself and loses nearly everything. In Disney's version, transformation becomes empowerment. And that difference reflects a much larger cultural change in how modern society approaches suffering. Old fairy tales warned people. Modern stories comfort people. That's not automatically bad. But it changes the purpose completely. Historically, fairy tales weren't originally written to protect children emotionally. They were written to prepare them emotionally. That's why so many original folk stories are horrifying. Because older societies lived much closer to death and hardship. Children witnessed disease, famine, violence, religious terror, public executions, infant mortality. Life itself was traumatic. Fairy tales became symbolic survival guides, teaching emotional lessons through metaphor. The woods represented danger, witches represented manipulation, monsters represented predatory people, transformation represented suffering and sacrifice. And mermaids? Mermaids represented longing powerful enough to destroy you. That's Anderson's version. Disney removes that warning entirely. And honestly, you can literally track how modern culture became uncomfortable with tragedy by watching how fairy tales evolved over time. The Grimm brothers softened their own stories in later editions. Victorian publishers removed sexual themes. 20th century media companies removed death and religious terror. Modern adaptations remove almost all ambiguity entirely. Everything gets polished, simplified, emotionally padded. Because modern audiences increasingly demand reassurance from stories rather than confrontation. And crew, that's understandable. Life's stressful enough already. Sometimes people just want to watch singing fish and eat popcorn without confronting existential despair. Fair. But there's something fascinating about what gets removed specifically. Notice what Disney eliminates: bodily suffering, emotional repression, identity destruction, conditional acceptance, spiritual uncertainty, invisible loneliness. All the psychologically difficult parts disappear first. And what replaces them? Individual empowerment fantasy. Ariel just follows her heart. Except Andersen's mermaid does follow her heart. That's the problem. His version asks, what if following your heart destroys you? That's a much scarier question. And frankly, a much more realistic one sometimes. Because Andersen understood that desire itself can become dangerous when tied to self-worth. The mermaid doesn't simply want love. She believes love is the only thing capable of making her existence meaningful. That dependency becomes catastrophic. Modern adaptations avoid this complexity because it unsettles audiences deeply. People prefer stories where identity transformation leads to empowerment. But Andersen presents transformation as psychologically destabilizing. The mermaid doesn't become more herself. She becomes fractured, disconnected, alienated from both worlds permanently. And that's probably why modern adaptations soften the story so aggressively. Because Andersen's original forces audiences to confront deeply uncomfortable truths. Love cannot fix existential emptiness. Self-destruction is not romantic. Suffering does not guarantee acceptance. Changing yourself for others can destroy you, and some wounds never fully heal. Those ideas are emotionally dangerous, especially inside children's stories. So modern culture replaced them with something easier to digest. Be brave and your dreams come true. Meanwhile, Andersen was over here writing, sometimes your dreams emotionally dismember you and leave your ghost wandering Earth for 300 years. Slight tonal difference there. But what's fascinating is that traces of the original horror still survive inside the Disney adaptation, accidentally. Why does Ariel lose her voice? Why does transformation hurt emotionally? Why does she feel trapped between worlds? Why does the ocean constantly symbolize longing and isolation? Because underneath all the bright colors and catchy songs, Andersen's ghost is still in there. You can soften the edges. You can rewrite the ending. You can add dancing seagulls and marketable plush toys. But the emotional skeleton of the original story still remains buried underneath everything. That's why even the Disney version often feels strangely melancholic despite its optimism. There's still an undercurrent of loss running beneath the fantasy. Ariel still abandons her world, still changes herself, still struggles with identity and belonging. The original tragedy echoes faintly through the adaptation like a ghost beneath the waves. And maybe that's why The Little Mermaid continues haunting people across generations. Because no matter how much culture sanitizes the story, the emotional truth underneath it never fully disappears. The fear of being unseen, the desire to belong, the temptation to reshape yourself for love, the loneliness of hiding your authentic identity. Those fears remain timeless. Andersen understood them too well to ever truly write a happy ending. That's why the original story still lingers in the shadows behind every modern version. Like the mermaid herself. Invisible. Voiceless. Still waiting beneath the surface while the world sings louder songs to drown her out. My thoughts. The real monster under the sea. After everything, the blood, the silence, the mutilation, the endless longing, the emotional destruction, the invisible suffering, the 300-year sentence, you start to realize something horrifying about The Little Mermaid. The story was never really about the ocean. The ocean is honest. That's the terrifying part. The sea witch is honest too. Cruel, absolutely, monstrous, without question, but honest. She tells the mermaid exactly what the bargain will cost. Every painful detail, every consequence. No lies, no false promises, no fake inspirational speeches about believing in yourself. The witch basically says, this transformation will destroy you physically and emotionally. You will suffer constantly. You may lose everything. And even if you succeed, it still might not save you. That's honesty. Brutal honesty, but honesty nonetheless. The real deception comes from society itself. The idea that acceptance can be earned through self-erasure. That if you just become prettier, quieter, more obedient, more useful, more lovable, eventually somebody will finally say, now you deserve to exist. That's the real curse. And yeah, people are still drowning in that curse today. That's why this story survives. Not because of mermaids, not because of magic. Because underneath all the fantasy lies something painfully recognizable, the human instinct to sacrifice authenticity for acceptance. And the horrifying truth is society often rewards it. People get praised for burnout, praised for silence, praised for emotional suppression, praised for sacrificing themselves endlessly for relationships, careers, expectations, appearances, status, or approval. Meanwhile, internally, they're bleeding through every step exactly like the mermaid, smiling beautifully while collapsing invisibly. That's Andersen's real horror. Not monsters under the sea. Monsters inside social expectations. And what makes the story even sadder is that the mermaid never once believes she deserves love as she is. Never. Not one time. From the beginning, she already believes. Her body is wrong. Her existence is incomplete. Her voice is inconvenient. Her world is inferior. Her identity must change. That insecurity existed before the sea witch. Which means the witch doesn't create the tragedy. She exploits it. That's important. The most dangerous systems in the world are the ones that convince people their pain is necessary for worthiness. Because once somebody believes that, they start volunteering pieces of themselves willingly. Andersen understood that psychology terrifyingly well. Probably because he lived it. He knew what it felt like to love somebody from a distance while pretending friendship was enough. He knew what it felt like to navigate society carrying truths that could isolate or destroy you if spoken aloud. He knew what it felt like to perform acceptable versions of himself publicly while suffering privately. The mermaid became the perfect metaphor for all of it. A creature trapped between worlds, silenced, longing, trying desperately to earn a place she was never allowed to occupy fully. And the truly devastating part? Even after all her suffering, she remains kind. That's what destroys me about Andersen's version. The mermaid never becomes cruel, never vindictive, never monstrous. Even at the very end, knife in hand, she refuses to save herself through violence. She chooses disappearance instead. And honestly, that might be the saddest thing in the entire story. Because it means the world convinced her that her own existence mattered less than everyone else's happiness. That's not romance. That's emotional martyrdom. Andersen wasn't celebrating that pain. He was mourning it. Warning people about it. screaming through metaphor about what happens when human beings believe they must destroy themselves to be worthy of love. That's why the original story feels so haunting compared to modern versions. Disney gives you resolution. Andersen gives you grief. Disney tells you, be yourself and everything works out. Andersen quietly whispers, what if the world punishes you for being yourself? That's a much scarier question, and unfortunately a much more human one. Because plenty of people throughout history have felt exactly like the mermaid. Too different. Too strange. Too broken. Too unwanted. Too unsafe to speak honestly. Walking through life on metaphorical knives, hoping eventually somebody sees the real them underneath the performance. That's why the story still resonates nearly 200 years later. Not because mermaids are fascinating. Because loneliness is. Because longing is. Because the fear of rejection is timeless. And because deep down, almost everybody understands what it feels like to look at the world and think, if I could just become someone else, maybe then I'd finally belong. That's the tragedy Andersen leaves us with. Not a sea monster. Not a villain. But a mirror. And maybe the cruelest truth hidden inside The Little Mermaid is this. The mermaid was never truly monstrous for wanting to change. The real monstrosity was a world that convinced her she had to. The fairy tale that never stopped bleeding. So the next time somebody tells you The Little Mermaid is just a harmless children's story, remember what's really hiding underneath it. A girl mutilates herself for acceptance. She loses her voice trying to enter a world that will never fully understand her. She suffers constantly in silence while everyone around her mistakes pain for grace. The person she loves never truly sees her. And even after sacrificing everything, peace still remains conditional. That's not fantasy. That's human history wearing seafoam. Hans Christian Andersen didn't write a bedtime story. He wrote emotional autopsy literature disguised as folklore. And maybe that's why the original version still feels so unsettling centuries later. Because despite all the magic and mythology, the emotional core is brutally real. People still silence themselves to survive socially, reshape themselves for love, hide identity for acceptance, perform happiness while suffering privately, and convince themselves pain is the price of belonging. That's why this story endures. Not because of mermaids, because the fear underneath the mermaid never disappeared. The fear that who you really are may never be enough for the world around you. And guys, that fear has destroyed a lot of people throughout history. That's why Andersen's ending refuses comfort. No wedding, no triumphant victory, no magical resolution where everything suddenly becomes fair. Because real emotional suffering rarely wraps itself up neatly. Sometimes wounds stay open. Sometimes loneliness lingers. Sometimes people spend years wandering emotionally invisible through the world, hoping eventually somebody sees them fully. That's the daughter of the air. Not just a ghost. A symbol of unresolved human longing itself. And maybe the saddest part of the entire story is this. The mermaid never actually hated herself. She hated the possibility that the world would reject her if she stayed herself. That difference matters. Because one's fear of rejection becomes stronger than self-acceptance, people start negotiating pieces of their identity away little by little, until eventually they barely recognize themselves anymore. That's Anderson's real warning. Not don't trust sea witches. Honestly, at this point, that one should already be obvious. The real warning is, do not lose yourself trying to earn permission to exist. Because the world will often take everything you offer and still ask for more. Anderson understood that truth personally. That's why the story feels less like fantasy and more like grief poured directly onto paper. The Little Mermaid isn't really about becoming human. It's about what happens when somebody believes they must stop being themselves in order to deserve love. And that idea remains terrifyingly relevant today. Maybe more than ever. Because modern society still sells transformation constantly. Change yourself. Improve yourself. Filter yourself. Optimize yourself. Perform yourself. Brand yourself. Silence inconvenient parts of yourself. All while quietly whispering, then maybe people will finally love you. And cupcakes. That's the exact same bargain the Sea Witch offered. Different century, different packaging, same psychological trap. That's why the original story still cuts so deeply. Because somewhere underneath all the folklore and tragedy, Anderson captured one of humanity's oldest emotional wounds. The fear that authenticity might cost us love. And the horrifying truth is, sometimes it does. But the story also leaves us with one final painful realization. The mermaid's suffering never made her weak. Her silence never made her lesser. Her longing never made her monstrous. She was worthy of love long before she ever stepped onto land. And the real tragedy is that nobody, including herself, fully believed it until it was too late. If you made it all the way through this documentary without staring blankly into the void afterward, first of all, congratulations. Second of all, you're probably emotionally unwell enough to fit right in around here. Because this ain't one of those channels where we clap like trained seals while billion-dollar corporations spoon-feed us sanitized bedtime stories wrapped in nostalgia and merchandising deals. Nah. Around here, we dig underneath the surface. Way underneath. Past the happy endings, past the corporate glitter, past the catchy songs and dancing sidekicks. Down where the real stories live. The uncomfortable stories, the forgotten stories, the stories people cleaned up because the original versions hit too hard. That's what we do here in the Pizzaverse. We crack open folklore, history, Hollywood myths, internet insanity, organized chaos, psychological horror, and cultural nonsense like a crowbar to a locked basement door. And honestly, the deeper you go, the weirder humanity gets. One minute you think you're researching a cute fairy tale about a fish girl. Next thing you know, you're knee-deep in existential despair, Victorian repression, emotional self-destruction, supernatural probation systems, sea witches harvesting eyeball pearls, and invisible ghost women wandering Earth for 300 years because some prince had the observational skills of a potato. That escalated quickly. So if you enjoyed this descent into emotional ocean trauma, hit the like button, subscribe, ring the bell, and maybe emotionally prepare yourself, because it turns out basically every old fairy tale is hiding some form of psychological nightmare underneath it. Seriously. The farther back you go into folklore, the less humanity sounds okay. We got cannibal queens, cursed children, ghost brides, dancing plagues, talking wolves, symbolic dismemberment, moral panic, existential punishment, and enough generational trauma to power the internet for another 1,000 years. And somehow people still wonder why old European villages looked permanently exhausted. Sweetheart, they were living inside nightmare metaphors. So stay locked in with Pizzaverse Studios and Palermo Productions for more documentaries covering dark folklore, hidden history, Hollywood corruption, internet anthropology, psychological horror, organized crime history, cultural myths, and whatever other beautifully cursed rabbit hole we fall into next. Because trust me, once you start seeing the hidden meanings underneath these stories, you can never look at them the same way again. And honestly, that's kind of the point.
Maybe he's right. Maybe there is something the matter with me. I just don't see how a world that makes such wonderful things could be bad. Look at this stuff, isn't it neat? Wouldn't you think my collection's complete? Wouldn't you think I'm the girl who has everything? Look at this trove, treasures untold. How many wonders can one cavern hold? Looking around here you think, sure, she's got everything. I've got gadgets and gizmos aplenty. I've got who's its and what's its galore. You want thingamabobs? I got 20. But who cares? No big deal. I want more. I want to be where the people are. I want to see them dancing, walking around on those, what do you call them? Oh, feet. Flipping your fins, you don't get too far. Legs are required for jumping, dancing, strolling along down a, what's that word again? Street. Up where they walk, up where they run, up where they stay all day in the sun, wandering free. Wish I could be part of that world. What would I give if I could live out of these waters? What would I pay to spend a day warm on the sand? Betcha on land they understand that they don't reprimand their daughters. Bright young women, sick of swimming, ready to stand and ready to know what the people know. Ask them my questions and get some answers. What's a fire and why does it, what's the word, burn? When's it my turn? Wouldn't I love to explore that shore up above? Out of the sea, wish I could be part of that world.
Giacomo's triple-decker fiction feast. 3 books, 0 witnesses. Narrated by Vincent Diprio. You ever hear a story so dramatic, so unbelievably cinematic, that halfway through it you stop listening like a human being and start listening like a homicide detective? Yeah, so that's this. Introducing Giacomo's triple-decker fiction feast. The only literary experience where every chapter feels like somebody screamed, "Quick, add more mafia!" before the deadline hit. For Bones in the Mafia, a delicious appetizer made from half-memory street legends, dramatic pauses, and enough "trust me bro" energy to legally qualify as its own religion. Every page asks the same question. Did this happen, or did somebody watch Goodfellas at 3 a.m. after 3 espressos? And buddy, the answer never arrives. Then comes the New 80s Mobster, NYC. A book so emotionally confusing, it feels like getting mugged by a VHS tape. Every paragraph sounds like, "Back in my day," followed immediately by something that absolutely did not happen. The dialogue, aggressive. The storytelling, chaotic. The accuracy, currently missing and presumed buried somewhere off the Jersey Turnpike. Scientists are still investigating whether this book was written or escaped captivity. And finally, a father's belief. Ah yes, the emotional finale, the "this one is definitely true. Guys, please stop asking questions" section of the evening. A heartfelt story about family honor, immigration, street gangs, mobsters, pizza life lessons, and enough inspirational speeches to make a Hallmark movie tap out from exhaustion. Every 5 minutes, somebody's father says something like, "A real man stands tall," while staring into the middle distance like he's auditioning for The Godfather Part 4, the sauce awakens. And listen, I ain't saying every story's fake. I'm saying these books got more dramatic turns than a Jersey diner parking lot at 2 a.m. At a certain point, you stop reading memoirs and start entering a cinematic multiverse where every pizzeria owner personally fought organized crime between lunch rushes. One guy reads these books and suddenly he's telling strangers, "You know I could have been connected." "No, you couldn't, Anthony. You sell hot tubs in Delaware." Relax. But the best part? The confidence. Because every story arrives with the energy of, "This absolutely happened, and if you question it, I'll stare at you emotionally near a brick oven." That's commitment. That's art. That's gastrointestinal fiction with extra mozzarella. Side effects of Giacomo's triple-decker fiction feast may include spontaneous storytelling, exaggerated hand gestures, imaginary mob connections, emotional confusion, unnecessary leather jackets, and referring to marinara sauce as gravy for attention. Do not consume while operating heavy machinery or researching actual history. And remember, this parody is intended for satire, commentary, entertainment, literary roasting, internet anthropology, and emotional survival. Nobody's accusing anybody of crimes. We're just trying to figure out how one human being experienced enough cinematic moments to fill 6 Scorsese movies and a late-night History Channel marathon. And honestly, that mystery alone deserves its own documentary. Giacomo's triple-decker fiction feast. When reality just ain't dramatic enough.
So anyway, So you put any lotion and then because without any lotion and the stick put up your ass, you're gonna damage your ass. So anyway, let's see who's there. We got a lot of guys there, which I'm very happy about that. I don't know. So okay, so let's see what I
Make fun of that he's slow. 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 Make fun.
So anyway,
Make fun of that he's slow. Make fun of that he's slow.
let's see who's there. We got a lot of guys there. So anyway,
Make fun of that he's slow. 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 Make fun of that he's